Are you getting enough fiber in your diet? If you're like most of us, you probably get way too little. This is tragic because people who consume a low fiber diet have an about 35% higher risk of dying from a heart attack or a stroke than people who eat a high fiber diet. In this video, I will share the fascinating science of how different types of dietary fiber lower the key cardiovascular disease risk factors, LDL cholesterol and insulin resistance. And I'll also share practical tips that you can implement in your own diet to very meaningfully lower your risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. Welcome to Nourished by Science on YouTube. My name is Mario, and on this channel I share evidence-based information about nutrition and the prevention of chronic disease. Today it's all about fiber. The stuff that promotes digestion and helps you stay regular might also be your heart's best friend. As we will see, if you get enough of the right types of fiber, you could dramatically lower your risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or ASCVD. I will share what the different types of fiber are, and if, how, and through which mechanisms each type of fiber affects cardiovascular disease risk, with a particular focus on two major cardiovascular disease risk factors, LDL cholesterol and insulin resistance. What are the different types of fiber? Let's start with what dietary fiber is. Dietary fiber is a type of carbohydrate that the body cannot digest. Most people think of fiber as something that promotes regular bowel movements, but fiber does much more than just keep us regular. We categorize dietary fiber into insoluble and soluble fiber. All plants contain both insoluble and soluble fiber in varying proportions. Insoluble fiber is the structural material of plants that gives them shape. It includes cellulose, lignin, and hemicellulose. This type of fiber is found in the bran of whole grains, which is the outer layer of the grain, and it's also found in the skin, stalks, and membrane of fruits and vegetables. Insoluble fiber adds bulk to the stool and prevents constipation by promoting regular bowel movements. Soluble fiber, as the name suggests, dissolves in water, forming a gel-like substance. It's found in oats, beans, lentils, fruits, and vegetables. Common soluble fibers that you may have heard about are beta-glucan, pectin, psyllium, and inulin. The impact of dietary fiber on LDL cholesterol. I'd like to start with a systematic review and meta-analysis of 24 randomized controlled trials published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which evaluated the effect of whole grain consumption on LDL cholesterol and other blood lipids in a total of 2,275 healthy adults, some of which had elevated cholesterol levels. The whole grain dose ranged from 28 grams per day to 213 grams per day across studies. Obviously a very broad range, and the duration of the studies ranged from 2 weeks to 16 weeks. What the authors found was that overall, whole grain consumption led to a drop in LDL cholesterol compared with a control diet. We're talking on average 3.5 milligrams per deciliter, a 2% reduction. Now, this was statistically significant and maybe potentially clinically relevant, but certainly not enough to write home or make a YouTube video about. However, this meta-analysis about the impact of whole grains on LDL cholesterol still provides valuable insights, because when the 11 RCTs that used oats were taken out of the analysis, the LDL cholesterol lowering effect of whole grains entirely disappeared. As it turned out, the only grain that has LDL cholesterol lowering effects was oats, whereas no other type of whole grain had any effect. Why would that be? Well, we know that oats are somewhat unique among the commonly consumed grains by being high in a type of soluble and viscous fiber, whereas other whole grains, such as wheat and rye, contain mostly insoluble fiber. So the first thing I'd like you to take away is that soluble fiber has an LDL cholesterol lowering effect, whereas insoluble fiber has no effects. But the story doesn't end here, because we can get soluble fiber from many other foods as well, not just from oats. And how much soluble fiber you eat overall matters more than you may think. Soluble fiber reduces LDL cholesterol in a dose-dependent manner. Let's look at another systematic review and meta-analysis. This one is of 181 randomized controlled trials that investigated the impact of soluble fiber on LDL cholesterol. It considered data from 14,505 adults, which included healthy participants, as well as people with elevated cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, or obesity. The authors estimated that each 5 gram of additional soluble fiber per day would result in an average reduction in total and LDL cholesterol by about 6 milligrams per deciliter. Just 5 more grams of soluble fiber per day, a cup of cooked black beans or a bowl of baby carrots with half an avocado, can meaningfully lower your LDL cholesterol over time. And an additional 10 grams per day even more so. Small changes implemented regularly can amount to quite a significant effect. The effect of viscous versus non-viscous soluble fiber. Research has shown that the more viscous a soluble fiber is, the more effective it is at lowering LDL cholesterol. What does that mean? Viscous fiber refers to soluble fiber that forms a thick viscous gel in our gut. Foods that are rich in viscous fiber include oats and barley, psyllium husks, chia seeds, avocado, beans, Brussels sprouts, and blackberries, just to name a few. It is the viscosity or the thickness of the gel it forms that plays a critical role in reducing LDL cholesterol. In a systematic review and meta-analysis of 89 randomized controlled trials published in 2023, the authors compared the effect of viscous fiber to non-viscous fiber on LDL cholesterol in a combined 4,755 adults. The median dose of viscous fiber was 7 grams per day, and the duration ranged from 3 to 52 weeks. On average, viscous fiber lowered LDL cholesterol by 10 milligrams per deciliter more than non-viscous fiber did. Why does a fiber's thickness matter so much for lowering LDL cholesterol? Let's take a look at what happens inside the gut. How does viscous fiber reduce LDL cholesterol? Our liver synthesizes cholesterol, which is packaged into very low density lipoprotein or VLDL particles for transport through the bloodstream, where the VLDL particles shed triglycerides and then eventually become low-density lipoprotein or LDL particles. These LDL particles deliver cholesterol to cells in various tissues, but they can also be trapped in the artery wall where they can contribute to atherosclerosis. That is why higher LDL cholesterol concentrations are associated with a higher risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. But the liver also uses cholesterol as a raw material to create bile acids, which are a key part of bile. Bile is collected in the gallbladder and secreted into the small intestine when we eat a fatty meal to help with fat digestion. After the bile acids have done their job, most are reabsorbed in the small intestine and returned to the liver, where they can be converted back into cholesterol. This process is known as enterohepatic circulation. This is where the viscous fiber comes in. When we consume viscous soluble fibers, these interrupt that cycle by trapping bile acid and cholesterol in the intestine and blocking its reabsorption. Similarly, viscous fibers can trap dietary cholesterol from a meal we just ate. The trapped bile acids and cholesterol then travel further down the small and large intestine and eventually are excreted in our feces. This means less bile acids and cholesterol are returned to the liver and less dietary cholesterol is absorbed, and this reduces the amount of cholesterol in the liver. And this ultimately lowers our blood LDL cholesterol levels. But that might not be the whole story. Emerging evidence suggests that fiber could also lower LDL cholesterol levels through a completely different pathway, the gut microbiome connection. There is emerging evidence that soluble fiber lowers LDL cholesterol by influencing cholesterol absorption through a mechanism that involves our gut microbiome. Most soluble fiber is fermentable by the bacteria in our gut, some more than others, while insoluble fiber is usually poorly fermentable. So when we consume soluble fiber, our gut bacteria ferment it and convert it into short-chain fatty acids. One of these short-chain fatty acids is called propionic acid and is thought to suppress the expression of a major cholesterol transporter in the small intestine. Scientists always come up with great names for stuff in our bodies, so this one they called Niemann-Pick C1-like 1 or NPC1L1. Don't blame me. Anywho, NPC1L1 is an interesting molecule because it is also the target for the lipid-lowering medication ezetimibe, also known by the brand name Zetia. So by being converted to propionate, soluble fiber reduces NPC1L1 activity, lowering cholesterol absorption from both food and from the bile. So we have talked about the impact and mechanism of soluble viscous fiber, and you might be thinking, does this mean we should just focus on soluble and particularly viscous fiber and ignore insoluble fiber? Not quite, because while insoluble fiber might not directly lower LDL cholesterol, it plays a role in something just as critical for cardiovascular health. Effect of insoluble fiber on insulin sensitivity. As you probably know, in addition to elevated LDL cholesterol, there are a lot of other risk factors for ASCVD, such as excess body fat mass or type 2 diabetes. I've shared in a prior video that diets rich in fiber tend to be more satiating per calorie. which helps us eat fewer calories and prevent or even reverse weight gain. And because carrying excess body fat is a key risk factor for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, a fiber-rich diet lowers our risk of becoming insulin resistant and developing type 2 diabetes, partly because it helps us prevent weight gain. However, some types of fiber actively improve insulin sensitivity in a way that is independent of body weight changes. And this is where insoluble fiber comes into play. Let's take a closer look. In a randomized crossover controlled feeding trial published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, overweight or obese adults free of diabetes with normal fasting blood sugar but elevated fasting insulin were fed either a whole grain diet containing about 20 grams of insoluble fiber per day for 6 weeks, or a refined grain diet providing about 11 grams of insoluble fiber per day. After 6 weeks, the participants went through a 6 to 9 week washout period and then switched to the other diet. Both the whole grain and refined grain diet were adjusted in calories to keep the participants' weight stable. And except for the difference between whole grain versus refined grain, they were identical and matched for macronutrient composition, types of fatty acids, and also amounts of soluble fiber. By study design, the only significant difference was the amount of insoluble fiber. After 6 weeks, participants on the whole grain diet showed a higher insulin sensitivity as measured by the gold standard hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp, or clamp for short. And that difference was quite meaningful. Really important to note here is that their body weights actually had not changed. In other words, the increase in insulin sensitivity could not be due to weight loss, but rather due to the insoluble fiber content, which by design was the only difference between the two study diets. Let's look at another study. This randomized crossover controlled feeding trial assessed insulin sensitivity, again using the gold standard clamp technique, in 17 overweight or obese women free of diabetes after 3 days of consuming either a low-fiber white bread or a white bread that was enriched specifically with insoluble fiber. The fiber amount was about 30 grams of insoluble fiber in the treatment group versus 0 insoluble fiber in the control group. The rest of the diet was identical in macronutrient composition and energy content to ensure participants maintained their weight. After a washout period, participants then switched over to the other diet, so everyone completed both diets. After participants consumed the insoluble fiber-enriched bread for just 3 days, insulin sensitivity again had increased significantly. What these studies show is that insoluble fiber improves insulin sensitivity in a manner that is independent of weight change. So this is in addition to any positive effect fiber may have on insulin sensitivity by helping us avoid weight gain. And that is something to pay attention to because this seems to translate to a lower risk of type 2 diabetes in people consuming more insoluble fiber. For example, a recent large prospective cohort study in China followed 16,272 participants without diabetes. During a median duration of 9 years, 1,101 people developed diabetes. The authors found that those who had the highest intake of insoluble fiber from a variety of sources had the lowest risk of developing diabetes. This is quite consistent with other cohort studies, showing that the risk of developing type 2 diabetes is consistently 15 to 30% lower in people consuming high fiber diets compared to those consuming low fiber diets. The big takeaway here is that when it comes to understanding the impact of fiber on cardiovascular disease risk, we have to keep the big picture in mind and recognize that both soluble and insoluble fiber are important. All types of fiber make our meals more satiating per calorie, thereby lowering our calorie intake and body weight, which in and of itself is associated with a lower risk of ASCVD. Soluble fiber specifically lowers LDL-Cholesterol concentrations, which also lowers the risk of ASCVD. And insoluble fiber improves insulin sensitivity, thereby lowering the risk of type 2 diabetes, which again lowers the risk of ASCVD. So what kind of risk reduction are we talking about here overall? Let's take a look. The impact of dietary fiber on cardiovascular disease risk. We have data from a massive systematic review and meta-analysis published a few years ago in The Lancet, which analyzed data from 185 observational studies and 58 randomized controlled trials. And it found that those with the highest total fiber intake compared to those with the lowest fiber intake experienced a 31% lower risk of dying from coronary heart disease, a 24% lower risk of having a heart attack, a 22% lower incidence of stroke, and they also observed a 15% lower risk of all-cause mortality in those with the highest compared to those with the lowest fiber intake. Higher fiber intake was also associated with a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes by 16% in those with the highest compared to the lowest fiber intake. Again, type 2 diabetes and also the determinants of glucose intolerance, particularly insulin resistance, are in and of themselves major risk factors for cardiovascular disease. The greatest reduction in disease risk was seen with 25 to 29 grams of total fiber per day, which is about twice as much as the average person in the United States, for example, is currently consuming. At the same time, the study suggested that even higher intakes could offer additional protection against heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers. In other words, more fiber equals better health. Practical tips to maximize dietary fiber intake. Now that we've covered the science behind how fiber reduces LDL cholesterol, improves insulin sensitivity, and lowers ASCVD risk, let's talk about practical ways to incorporate more fiber into your daily diet. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recommends 14 grams of total fiber for every 1,000 kilocalories of food consumed. For an adult woman, that's about 25 grams per day in dietary fiber, and for a man, it's about 38 grams per day. There is no specific guideline for soluble fiber, but based on the evidence, 10 grams per day would be a good target to shoot for. And by the way, the actual total dietary fiber intake in the US population right now is only about 15 grams per day, far below what is recommended, so there is a lot of room for improvement. So what could the fiber intake look like for an entire day? I will use myself as an example and share what I might eat in a typical day. I'll often start the day with Greek yogurt with pecans and blueberries for breakfast. Blueberries, or all berries really, are a great source of fiber. You can see I also add 2 teaspoons of psyllium husk to my yogurt, which thickens the yogurt a bit. It all comes out to about 590 kilocalories, about 12 grams of total fiber, and of that, 3.5 grams is soluble fiber. This breakfast keeps me full for a while. Then for lunch, I love having a big mixed salad, like this one, with greens and different kinds of vegetables and fruits. I love to add things like celery, fennel, and maybe a pear, and all of these are really high in fiber. Plus tuna and goat cheese for protein and roasted sunflower seeds for crunch. A salad like this packs a big punch as far as fiber, and it's very easy to make different variations of this. Smoked salmon or some grilled chicken instead of the tuna, some nuts instead of the sunflower seeds, an apple instead of the pear, and some days I'll have goat cheese, other days feta or some shaved Parmesan cheese. As you can see, including a homemade vinaigrette dressing, this version comes out to about 788 kilocalories with over 23 grams of total fiber and 6 grams of soluble fiber. This lunch alone gets me more than halfway to my goal fiber intake. On days when I am busy, an alternative lunch might be a big bowl of chili or lentil soup with vegetables cooked the day before, maybe with a slice of gluten-free whole grain bread, which would also get me about 15 grams of fiber. For dinner, I might have a mixed meal like this. A whole bunch of steamed cauliflower, a side salad, boiled potatoes, and a nice bratwurst. Yes, okay, I'm German and I like some sausage sometimes. Bratwurst is actually not all that great nutritionally, as it's pretty fatty and energy dense, and a piece of unprocessed meat would be a bit better in a lot of ways. But you don't need to be perfect all the time if you generally make good choices. And in this case, I simply eat a huge portion of the salad and the cauliflower rather than mostly sausage and a tiny portion of vegetables. This is a pretty hearty meal. Comes out to 813 kilocalories with a total of almost 12 grams of total fiber and 3.1 grams of soluble fiber. On other days, I might have brown rice or quinoa instead of potatoes, maybe with another piece of meat or fish, and again, a very large pile of salad or vegetables. I think you can see the meal pattern. I usually have either a salad or a lot of cooked vegetables with my lunch and dinner. As far as my snacks, I might have carrots, an apple, and an orange, and this adds another 10 grams of total fiber or so to my day. So where does this leave me at the end of the day? With 3 meals and my snacks, I come in at 2,340 kilocalories with a total of about 58 grams of total fiber, and of that, almost 16 grams of soluble fiber. That may sound high, but what this illustrates is that fiber intake is as much about eating fiber-rich foods as it is about avoiding foods that have been stripped of their natural fiber content, like a lot of ultra-processed foods, refined grains, and added sugars. So my main tips are, first, always include a very large serving of a salad, vegetables, or other fiber-rich plant foods, such as legumes, fruit, or berries. And second, look where you can make easy food swaps to minimize foods that are totally devoid of fiber. Brown rice instead of white rice. Whole grain bread with nut butter instead of white bread and butter. Whole fruit instead of fruit juice. You get the idea. By the way, if you're new to increasing fiber, it's important to start slow and gradually increase your fiber intake to give your gut time to adjust. Increasing fiber intake too quickly, particularly from foods like legumes, can temporarily cause bloating, gas, or digestive discomfort. By giving your gut and its inhabitants time to adjust, you can enjoy the benefits of fiber while minimizing any unwanted side effects. What about fiber supplements? Depending on your current diet, lifestyle, and food preferences, you might be wondering, can't I just take a fiber supplement and call it a day? You saw that I sprinkled some psyllium husk onto my yogurt as well. That's technically a fiber supplement. My view is that fiber supplements can certainly help, but they should ideally not replace whole foods. While fiber supplements often just contain one or two specific types of fiber, whole plant foods provide a variety of different soluble and insoluble fibers, and there's almost certainly a benefit to consuming a variety of different types of fiber. Further, these same plant foods that contain the most fiber also are very micronutrient dense, meaning they provide essential vitamins, minerals, and trace elements. Similarly, fiber-rich plant foods tend to be very rich in secondary plant compounds, such as polyphenols, compounds that are not essential to us but that have health benefits, for example by acting as antioxidants. Fiber-rich plant foods also have a low energy density, and eating a lot of them makes it difficult to overeat calories. Including whole fiber-rich plant foods in a meal is also known to lower the blood glucose response to that meal. In other words, try to eat a variety of unprocessed or minimally processed whole plant foods every day, ideally with every meal. That said, if you struggle to get enough fiber from food alone, adding a supplement can be a helpful boost. Again, remember to start with a small dose and increase gradually. Summary and conclusions. In summary, we have strong scientific evidence that soluble, especially viscous fiber, reduces LDL cholesterol concentrations in fasting blood, while insoluble fiber improves insulin sensitivity and reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes. We also have good evidence that these effects translate to a lower risk for cardiovascular diseases in people eating the most fiber. My recommendation is to aim for about 38 grams of total fiber per day if you are an adult male, and 25 grams of total fiber if you are an adult female. There are no consistent guidelines for intake of soluble fiber specifically, but the evidence points towards aiming for 10 to 15 grams in soluble fiber per day. Try to consume the majority of fiber from whole, unprocessed plant foods like vegetables, fruit, berries, legumes, whole grain, and also nuts and seeds in moderation. Fiber supplements are also a good option, but prioritize getting your fiber from whole plant foods due to their numerous other health benefits. Okay, that's it for this video. As always, I have published a blog post that includes all of the references. The link to that blog post is in the description box below. If this was helpful, please press the thumbs up button below and share the video with anyone you think may be interested. Also, let me know if you have any questions or comments. Let me also thank Yoshiko Roth Hidalgo for her very capable help with this video. Yoshiko is currently pursuing a graduate degree in clinical nutrition, and she is completing an internship with me. She led much of the research and production of this video, so thank you very much, Yoshiko. Lastly, let me thank the patrons of this channel. As you may know, it is my goal to produce evidence-based videos and the associated blog posts in a way that is independent of financial conflicts of interest. We therefore do not engage in any sponsorships, affiliate marketing, or any other relationship with the food, supplement, or pharmaceutical industries. If you value our unbiased approach to making high-quality content freely available, please consider becoming a patron of the channel at patreon.com. Again, I've left a link to the Patreon page in the description box below the video. Thank you for watching, and take care.